Nobody at Bravo Medical Station could explain the photograph. It had been pinned above locker 73 for almost 2 years, a sun-bleached, creased rectangle of photographic paper showing a woman standing in front of a jet so black it seemed to consume the light around it. The jet had no visible markings, no tail number, no unit insignia, just the raw geometry of a machine built for one purpose. The woman in the photo wore no flight suit. She stood in blue scrubs, hands in her pockets, squinting into the horizon as though she expected something to come out of it. She didn't look heroic, she didn't look dangerous. She looked like she was waiting for a bus. The locker belonged to Petty Officer First Class Marlo Voss. The nurses called her Voss. The doctors called her Voss. The orderlies who worked the overnight rotation sometimes called her Ghost, because she had a habit of appearing in rooms a full second before anyone heard the door open. She was 34 years old, 5 feet 5, with close-cropped brown hair that she kept tucked behind her ears, and eyes that catalogued every room she walked into with an efficiency that had nothing to do with nursing. She smiled infrequently, she spoke in complete sentences or not at all. She never, under any circumstances, discussed the photograph. It was Sergeant Dales who first made the joke. He was a trauma surgeon with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously wrong about anything he could measure. He had seen the photograph on his 3rd day at the station and made up his mind about it inside of 10 seconds. He told the joke in the break room in front of 6 people over bad coffee at 200 hours. He said the jet was probably a stock photo from a calendar. He said women like Voss didn't end up in cockpits. He said they ended up in corridors, which was fine because corridors needed tending too. He laughed at his own joke with the comfort of a man who had never once considered that the people in his audience might know something he didn't. Voss was not in the break room when he said it. She was in Bay 4, redressing a burn wound with the kind of methodical care that borders on meditation. She didn't hear the joke, but the words traveled as words in small stations always do, and by 600 she had heard a version of them. She finished her shift. She washed her hands. She walked past locker 73, paused for exactly 1 second, and then continued out the door into the steel-gray light of a morning that smelled like diesel and coming rain. Nobody followed her, nobody thought to. That was the first mistake, there would be others. The second mistake happened 3 weeks later, on a Thursday, during the kind of afternoon that tricks you with its quietness. A cargo flight had come in from the Eastern Corridor. Nobody thought much of it. Cargo flights came and went like weather, unremarkable until they weren't. This one carried 2 pallets of medical supplies, and in the aft jump seat a man named Warrant Officer T. Jun Ri. He was from a unit whose designation appeared on no public document. He wore standard-issue boots and a jacket with the patches removed. He carried a sealed manila envelope in his left hand, and he held it the way a man holds something he has been told, very specifically, not to lose. He walked into the station, identified himself at the desk, and asked, in a voice that suggested the question was a formality rather than an inquiry, whether Petty Officer First Class Marlo Voss was on shift. The desk officer, a young specialist named Grubb, blinked. He said Voss didn't come on until 1800. He asked if there was a message. Ri said there was not. He sat in a plastic chair near the entrance and waited. He did not read. He did not use his phone. He sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the door for 4 hours and 11 minutes. And when the door opened at 1804 and Marlo Voss walked in still pulling her jacket zipper up, Ri stood immediately. Voss looked at him for 2 seconds. Something passed across her face, not surprise and not quite recognition, but something between them, like the feeling of a word you know but cannot pronounce. She said quietly, "How bad?" Ri said, "The kind that doesn't get discussed here." She nodded. She told the desk officer she needed to reschedule her intake rounds. The desk officer started to protest. They were short-staffed. They were always short-staffed. But something in the way Voss turned away from him stopped the protest before it became words. She walked with Ri to the far end of the corridor, and they stood near the supply room door and spoke for 11 minutes. During those 11 minutes, 2 nurses who passed through the corridor both later reported that they could not hear a single word of what was being said, despite the corridor being otherwise silent. Dales was among those who noticed. He was coming off a 4-hour procedure and his scrubs were stained in the particular way that demands a hot shower and a cold drink, and he paused at the end of the corridor and watched Voss and Ri with the same look he gave imaging results he hadn't expected. Curious, slightly annoyed, unwilling to admit confusion. He asked the desk officer who the visitor was. Grubb said he didn't know. Dales asked what unit. Grubb said the patch slots were empty. Dales made the sound of a man filing something away for later. He continued to his quarters. Later that night, he would tell 2 of the other surgeons about the interaction, and the 3 of them would arrive at the same comfortable conclusion, probably a personal matter, probably a relative, probably nothing. They were wrong about all three. Marlo Voss had not always been a nurse. This was the thing the photograph knew and nobody at Bravo Station thought to ask about. The records that might have explained it were stored in a system that required a clearance level 3 tiers above anything that station possessed. What existed in her accessible file was clean, simple, and told a story that was technically true in every detail and comprehensively misleading in its totality. It said she had completed her nursing certification through the Navy's enlisted medical program. It said she had served 2 tours in support roles. It said she had commendations for patient care under adverse conditions. All of that was real. What it did not say was that before the nursing certification, before the support roles, before the commendations, Marlo Voss had spent 6 years flying a platform that the official record described only as test and evaluation assets, classified. What it did not say was that she had logged 412 hours in conditions that would have killed most pilots through a combination of hypoxia, disorientation, and the kind of fear that compounds on itself until it becomes something chemical. What it did not say was that she had once guided a crippled aircraft over a coastline using nothing but manual hydraulic pressure and a compass she had borrowed from a survival kit, and that she had landed that aircraft on a strip that was 40 meters shorter than minimum specifications, and that the aircraft had stopped with 17 meters to spare, and that she had climbed out and sat on the wing for 40 minutes before anyone reached her. She had not cried, she had not shaken visibly. She had, by all accounts, looked out at the horizon with those cataloging eyes and said, to no one in particular, the crosswind was late. The unit she flew for had a name that was never spoken in meetings and was referenced in documents only by a 4-character alphanumeric code. Her call sign in that unit had been Wren, a name given to her not for the bird's delicacy but for the bird's range. Wrens, her flight instructor had told her once, migrate farther relative to their body size than almost any other creature on Earth. They look like they shouldn't make it. They always do. She left that world for reasons that were hers alone. The transition to nursing was not a defeat, though many people who heard about it assumed it was. It was something more deliberate. She had spent 6 years being the sharpest instrument in a room that nobody was allowed to describe, and she had decided with the same quiet precision she applied to everything that she wanted to spend time in rooms where the stakes were visible, where the wound was in front of you, where you could see the outcome of your hands. She was good at nursing. She was good at most things she applied herself to, which was both a gift and a weight she had learned to distribute evenly. The photograph above Locker 73 was taken the morning after the landing. Someone in the unit had a camera. She had not known the photo existed until it arrived in an envelope 6 months after she left, with no note inside. She had kept it, she couldn't have explained why. The call came in on a Friday, and Friday at Bravo Station had a particular quality, a loosening, a slight drop in institutional vigilance. That meant the 3 people who heard the initial transmission on the main comms board all processed it with a half-second delay they would not have had on a Tuesday. The voice on the channel was calm, calibrated, the kind of calm that is the product of training rather than temperament. Bravo Medical, this is Spear 3-1. We have a situation developing at Grid November 7, requesting immediate coordination, medical standby, and a pause that was 1 beat too long to be technical, whoever you have on station with experience in high-altitude asset recovery. The comms officer, a petty officer named Driscoll, reached for the acknowledgement key by reflex. She pressed it. She said, Spear 3-1, Bravo Medical copies. Stand by for and then stop, because she had just registered the last part of the transmission and it didn't match anything in the standard request matrix. High-altitude asset recovery was not a medical function. It was not a phrase that appeared in the station's operational vocabulary at all. She asked her supervisor, Lieutenant Ferris, who read the request twice and went to find the station commander, who was a man named Commander Breton who had been in theater for 11 months and who had, over those 11 months, developed the ability to distinguish between calls that were unusual and calls that were significant. He read the transmission. He looked up. He said, Get me Voss. Driscoll blinked. She said, Sir, Voss is a... I know what Voss is, Breton said. Get her. The order moved through the station in the way that anomalous orders do, faster than normal orders, carried by curiosity as much as urgency. It reached the medication room where Voss was inventorying IV bags with the focused attention she gave to everything small. The corpsman who delivered it, a young man named Trells, was slightly out of breath. He said the commander wanted her in the comms room immediately. Voss set down the clipboard. She asked, What channel? Trells said he didn't know. Voss walked out of the medication room without her clipboard and moved through the station at a pace that was not quite running and not quite walking, something purposeful and intermediate that cleared the corridor ahead of her without her raising her voice. She pushed through the comms room door and Breton stepped aside without being asked. She sat in front of the board. She keyed the channel. She said, Spear 3-1, this is Bravo Medical, say nature of recovery. There was a silence on the line that lasted 4 seconds. Then the voice from Spear 3-1 said something that made every person in that room go absolutely still. It said, Ren, that you? The silence in the comms room lasted longer than it should have. Commander Breton was watching Voss the way you watch a seismic reading, not expecting the earthquake, but recognizing with some animal part of your brain that the numbers are wrong in an important way. Driscoll had her hand frozen above her keyboard. Trells, still standing near the door, had stopped breathing without being aware of it. Voss put her hand flat on the console. Her face did not change expression. Her voice, when she answered, was level in the way that only comes from having practiced level for years. She said, Spear 3-1, confirm your primary. Who am I talking to? A crackle, then Volkov, but you know the voice. She did. The voice on the other end of the channel belonged to a man named Alexei Volkov, which was not his real name but was the name he had used in the unit for so long that most people had forgotten it was a call sign. She had not seen him in 4 years. She had not expected to see him again in any medium. She said, what is the situation at November 7? He said, one of ours went down, unusual circumstances. The frame is intact, but we have a pilot situation and we have a secondary payload that cannot be left on site. We need exfil, we need medical support, and we need someone who can communicate with the recovery team without a 12-step briefing on what the asset is. Breton leaned in, he said quietly to Voss, asset meaning personnel or equipment. She held up one finger. Into the channel she said, pilot status. Volkov said, alive, coherent, but she's been on site for 9 hours in cold conditions and she's had a hypoxic event. She needs your eyes on her before we move her. Voss said, understood, ETA to November 7 on ground transport. Breton said, 40 minutes by helo. Voss relayed it. Volkov said, you're coming. She said, is that a question or request? He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had shifted almost imperceptibly, a frequency below operational, something closer to personal. He said, it's a request. You're the only one here who's been through a high-altitude hypoxic event and knows what to ask. She said, copy, 30 minutes to wheels up. She stood, she turned to Breton. For a moment they looked at each other and something was communicated between them that neither would have been able to fully articulate, a mutual recalibration, a revision of assumptions, a quiet and professional acknowledgement that the version of Marlowe Voss that Breton had believed he understood was incomplete. He said, I'll authorize the helo. She said, bring Trells, he's steady. She walked out of the comms room toward the equipment bay and the corridor behind her felt different in her wake. Dales was coming the other direction. He stopped when she passed. She didn't acknowledge him. He watched her go with an expression that was, for the first time, something other than dismissive. He couldn't have named exactly what replaced it, but it was the beginning of something. The helicopter lifted from Bravo Station into a sky the color of old iron. Voss sat in the jump seat opposite Trells with a medical kit between her knees and her eyes on the window. The rotor noise made conversation difficult, which suited her. She had spent the 12 minutes between leaving the comms room and boarding the helo in a state of focused preparation that looked, from the outside, like stillness, running through protocols, sequencing variables, letting muscle memory conduct its own inventory. Trells watched her from across the cabin. He was 23 years old and had been a corpsman for 2 years, and he had in those 2 years formed the opinion that Voss was competent in a way that was slightly intimidating and largely unknowable. He had never tried to form a theory about the photograph. He had simply accepted it as part of the background, the way you accept a landmark. They are permanent, not requiring explanation. Sitting across from her now, watching her run her fingers along the edge of the medical kit without looking at it, he thought for the first time about what the photograph might mean. He thought about the jet. He thought about the flat prairie scrub of her expression in the image and the identical quality of that expression now, and he had a sudden clear understanding that these were not 2 separate periods of a woman's life but the same continuous thing, expressed through different instruments. The pilot, a chief petty officer named Aguilin, called back, 20 minutes out, weather at November 7 is clear but cold, wind from the northwest at 12. Voss said, any comms from Spear 3-1 since we left? Aguilin said, negative, they've gone quiet. Voss absorbed this. Quiet meant one of 2 things: either the situation had stabilized and they were conserving signal, or the situation had developed and they were too occupied for channel maintenance. She said, keep trying on alternates. She turned back to the window. Below them, the landscape was moving past in long strip panels, the particular kind of terrain that provides no comfort, only scale. She had flown over landscapes like this many times. From altitude in the platform she used to fly, terrain like this became abstract, pure geometry, pure problem. Up close on the ground, it became something else, something that required a different kind of attention. She thought about the downed pilot. Hypoxic event, 9 hours on site, cold exposure. She ran the clinical sequence in her head: temperature management, neurological assessment, respiratory monitoring. She thought about what it felt like to come out of hypoxia, the gray gauze of it, the way the edges of consciousness came back before the center did, like a photograph developing in reverse. She had been through it once. Once was enough to know what the woman at November 7 was navigating. The hello banked slightly. Through the window, Voss could see the approach of a terrain feature, a long ridge running east-west, the kind that catches weather and turns it. On the far side of it, somewhere in the flat between the ridge and the tree line, was the site. Trell said, "You've done this before, this kind of call." It wasn't quite a question. She turned from the window. She looked at him with those flat, cataloging eyes and said, "The medical part, yes." He waited to see if more was coming. She said, "The other part, also yes." And then she turned back to the window, and the ridge came up beneath them, and on the other side of it the site appeared, a dark shape in the gray-brown of the terrain, surrounded by 4 figures in full tactical gear who had arranged themselves in a perimeter that, even from altitude, had the taut geometry of people who were not relaxed. Agelin said, "I have the site coming in." Voss closed her eyes for 2 seconds. When she opened them, something had settled in her face, the last of whatever divided attention remained. She was fully present now in the specific way that only certain people in certain kinds of moments learn to be. She said, "Trells, stay with the kid until I assess." He said, "Copy." The ground came up beneath them, the hello touched down. The wind hit first, a dry, cutting northwest wind that arrived before the rotor wash had finished its business with the grass around the landing site. Voss stepped out and oriented herself in under 3 seconds. Downed aircraft to the north, 3 operators maintaining perimeter, 1 kneeling by a figure on the ground, portable shelter positioned against the wind, 2 vehicles at the far edge of the site with their engines running. The figure kneeling by the pilot stood as Voss approached. He was tall, dressed in gear that had the worn quality of things used for real purposes repeatedly, and when he turned she recognized Volkov before she reached him, the same broad economic face, the same quality of attention that he directed at everything, as though everything was a variable requiring assessment. He said, "She's conscious, keeps trying to give us a status report." Voss said, "That's good." He said, "She's been doing it for 3 hours." Voss said, "That's also good." She dropped to her knees beside the pilot. The downed pilot was a woman approximately 10 years younger than Voss. She was wrapped in a thermal blanket, and her face had the washed-out quality of someone who had spent time at altitude without enough oxygen, a certain flatness of color, a particular quality of effort to the eyes. She was looking at Voss with clear, tracking eyes, which was the most important thing. Voss said, "I'm a medical officer. Can you tell me your name?" The pilot said her name was Lieutenant Kaida Norris. Voss said, "Do you know where you are?" Norris said she did not know exactly, but that she had been down since approximately 700, and that she had hypoxic symptoms beginning at approximately 12,000 feet, and that she had managed the descent manually, and that the aircraft was intact and that the payload was secured. She said all of this in a sequence that had clearly been rehearsed during the 3 hours she had been lying on the ground, as though maintaining the ability to deliver it was a way of maintaining herself. Voss said, "The aircraft is handled, the payload is handled, you don't need to report to me. Can you tell me if you have pain anywhere?" Norris blinked. The sudden permission not to report seemed to catch her off guard. She said, "Left shoulder, harness impact." Voss moved her hands to the left shoulder area. She worked quickly, professionally, in the focused way that was simply her baseline. Volkov stood behind her. He had not moved since she arrived. The operators on the perimeter had not looked away from their sectors. At one point during the assessment, Norris looked up at Voss and said, "Are you the one they called Ren?" Voss's hands continued moving. She said, "Who told you that?" Norris said, "Volkov on the way down. He said if the worst happens, try to hold on until Ren gets here. He said Ren knows what it's like." The wind moved through the grass around them. Voss completed the shoulder assessment. She said quietly, not in a clinical register, "Yeah, I know what it's like." Norris closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, some of the effort had gone out of them. The effort of holding, of reporting, of maintaining. Something had been given permission to rest. It was, Voss thought, the most fundamental thing medicine ever did, not the procedures, not the protocols, but the moment when a person understood that someone else had taken the weight, just briefly, just enough. She sat back, she looked at Volkov, she said, "She's stable, we can move her in 20. He nodded, he said, "Good to have you back in the field, Ren." She said, "I'm not back, I'm passing through." He almost smiled, he turned back to the perimeter. The flight back was quieter than the flight out, but quiet in the way that has texture, a silence that carries the residue of what has happened rather than the anticipation of what might. Norris was stabilized on the stretcher, an IV running, her breathing regular and her color returning in small increments, like the sky after a front moves through. Trells monitored her vitals with steady attention. Voss sat against the bulkhead and watched the window again, but differently now. The iron sky had softened to something closer to pewter. The light was changing. Agelin's voice came through the headset. "Bravo Medical, 45 minutes out." Voss acknowledged. She pulled off the headset and let the rotor noise fill the absence. She was tired in a specific way, not the tired of having done too much, but the tired of having held a particular quality of attention for an extended period. The kind of tired that confirms you were actually present. She recognized it from another life. It was not an unpleasant feeling. Norris's eyes opened. She looked at the ceiling of the hello for a moment, then turned her head toward Voss. She said, "How long were you in the program?" Voss said, "Long enough." Norris said, "I've been in 3 years. Sometimes I wonder if it's—" She trailed off. The sentence didn't need finishing. Voss said, "If it's what?" Norris said, "If it's worth what it costs." The hello moved through a pocket of turbulence. Voss let the question sit for a moment. She was not someone who rushed answers. She said, "That's a question that changes its answer depending on when you ask it. Right now, from where you are, I think the answer is probably complicated." Norris said, "What's the answer from where you are?" Voss looked at her. She said, "I'm a nurse in a forward station who also happens to know what a hypoxic event feels like from the inside. This morning, that made a difference to you. Whether it was worth what it cost is above my pay grade to decide, but it wasn't nothing." Norris absorbed this. She said, "They told me you walked away." Voss said, "I did." Norris said, "They made it sound like a loss." Voss said, "For them it probably was." Something shifted in Norris's expression, a recalibration that was visible even in her diminished state. She said, "I want to know what it's like on the other side of it." Voss said, "Ask me when you're not hypoxic." The faintest possible thing that could be called a smile crossed Norris's face. She closed her eyes again. Her breathing settled into the comfortable rhythm of someone genuinely resting, not fighting for rest. Trells looked up from the vital monitor. He and Voss held eye contact for a moment. He said nothing. He returned to the monitor. The pewter sky deepened. Below, the landscape began to shift, the long barren stretches giving way to the visible order of a base perimeter, roads, structures, light. Civilization, which was a relative term in this context, but which meant a bed, a mess hall, a dry place to stand. Voss thought about Locker 73. She thought about the photograph and the specific quality of its light, and the way she had looked in it, not aware of the camera, not performing anything, just standing in front of something extraordinary and treating it like the ordinary furniture of her life. She thought about Dale's in the break room at 200 and the 6 people around the table, and the way the joke had traveled down the corridor and arrived in Bay 4 where she was redressing a burn wound. She was not angry about it. She had moved through anger about things like that years ago, in the way you move through a climate, slowly, with the full understanding that the climate is indifferent to your feelings about it, and that what matters is what you wear when you go out into it. What she was, she thought, was patient, profoundly, constitutionally patient. Things revealed themselves on their own schedule. She had never needed to explain the photograph because the photograph was not the point. The point was the landing, the 17 meters, the crosswind that was late. The hello began its descent. The landing pad lights came up below them, clean and precise in the failing light. The story that moved through Bravo Station that evening had the quality of all good stories. It changed slightly with each telling, but its essential shape remained. A special operations team, a downed aircraft, a call on an unfamiliar channel, and at the center of it, requested by name in a voice that clearly knew the name from somewhere significant, Petty Officer First Class Marlo Voss. The details that survived most cleanly across versions were these: that she had known the operator on the channel, and that the operator had used a name for her that was not Voss, and that the name had the sound of something operational rather than personal, that she had left the station in a hello at tactical speed, and returned 4 hours later with a stabilized pilot, and the particular quality of composure that doesn't come from not having been in a difficult situation, but from having navigated it. That Trells, who had gone with her, said very little about what he had seen, and that the little he said was very precise. Dales heard the version that Driscoll told, which was the version most closely connected to primary sources because Driscoll had been in the comms room for the whole of the original transmission. Driscoll was a careful, honest narrator. She said that when the voice on the channel used the name Wren, Voss had not flinched, and that the absence of flinching was itself informative because it meant the name was familiar rather than surprising. She said that Breton, who had been in theater for 11 months and had the bearing of a man who was not easily reordered, had deferred to Voss in the comms room in a way that was functional rather than courtesy, the deference of someone operating below their expertise level to someone operating within theirs. Dale sat with this. He was a man who processed information through a particular kind of internal audit, assembling facts, checking them against the structure he had built of a situation, looking for the failure points. He could not, in honesty, find a failure point in the version of Voss that was emerging from the story. He went back to the conversations he had in the break room. He went back to the joke. He found when he got there that the joke was no longer funny in the way it had been. It had not become offensive exactly, or perhaps it had, but that was not the primary thing he felt. The primary thing was something closer to the particular embarrassment of a professional who has made a confident claim in an area where they did not, in fact, have complete information. It was the intellectual discomfort of a wrong answer. Dales was a man who did not like wrong answers, including the ones he generated himself. He went to the nursing station that night. Voss was on shift. She was working at the supply cart, her back to him, and she turned when she heard his step. She waited. He said, "I heard what happened today." She said, "No." He said, "The pilot is stable." She said, "Norris is doing well. We'll monitor overnight." He said, "Good." A pause in which both of them recognized that the substance of the conversation had not yet been reached. He said, "I said something a few weeks ago in the break room. I should tell you that I..." She said, "You don't have to." He said, "I think I do. I made an assumption." She looked at him with those flat, precise eyes. She said, "Most people do. It's not a particularly unusual feature of the situation." He said, "That doesn't make it right." She said, "No, it doesn't." She picked up the supply cart and moved it 2 feet to the left. She said without looking at him, "The photograph is real, if that's what you're wondering. The jet is real. It wasn't a calendar." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I know. I think I knew after today." She said, "Then we're caught up." She returned to her work. He stood for a moment, then nodded to himself in the way of a man completing a necessary transaction and walked back down the corridor. The corridor felt the same. Everything looked the same, but the map had changed the way maps do when you learn that the blank space contains something after all. Lieutenant Kaida Norris spent 2 nights in the medical station before she was cleared for transfer. During those 2 nights, she was a model patient, compliant, clear-eyed, asking intelligent questions about her recovery timeline. And during those 2 nights, Voss was her primary care provider for the overnight rotation. They did not speak at length. The conversations that happened were medical in content and brief in duration. But at the end of the second night, Norris asked if she could ask one question that was not medical. Voss said she could try. Norris said, "What made you decide to leave the program?" Voss was charting at the desk near the bed. She did not stop charting. She said, "I wanted to see the faces." Norris said, "What faces?" Voss said, "In the aircraft, everything is abstracted. Distance, altitude, systems. The outcomes of what you do are real, but they happen somewhere else to people you never see. I wanted to be in the room where the outcome happens." Norris was quiet for a moment. She said, "Do you miss it?" Voss completed the entry she was working on. She set down the stylus. She said, "I miss the sky. I don't miss the abstraction." Norris said, "That's a very honest answer." Voss said, "It's the only kind I know how to give." Norris said, "Volkov said that about you. He said you were the most honest person in the unit. He said it wasn't comfortable." The faintest suggestion of something warm moved across Voss's face. She picked up the stylus again. She said, "That sounds right." Norris said, "Can I tell you something?" Voss said, "Go ahead." Norris said, "When he said your name on the way down, when I was still in the aircraft and things were going wrong and he was on the channel with me telling me to hold on, he said, 'Wren knows what it's like and Wren will be there.' And I didn't know who Wren was, but the way he said it." She paused. She pulled in a breath and let it out. "It made me feel like whoever Wren was, things would be okay." Voss said nothing. She continued charting, but the quality of her stillness had changed, had deepened, the way deep water deepens. Something had been touched that she kept carefully managed, and she was managing it now, efficiently, privately, the way she managed most things. After a moment she said, "Get some sleep." Norris said, "Yes, ma'am." It was the first time anyone at Bravo station had said ma'am to Voss. She didn't acknowledge it, but in the small, telling calculus of her expression, something acknowledged it for her. The debrief came on day 4, unexpected in the sense that all things you have been waiting for without admitting you are waiting are unexpected. A vehicle arrived at Bravo station at 900. 2 officers she did not recognize and one she did. The one she recognized was a commander from Naval Special Programs whose name she knew, and whose presence at a forward medical station meant that the envelope Rhea had carried 3 weeks ago was connected to something larger than the downed aircraft. Breton met her in the corridor outside his office. He said, "They've asked for you by name." He said it with the particular care of someone relaying information they know will matter. She said, "Which name?" He said, "Both." She went in. The debrief lasted 2 hours. She would not discuss its content afterward, and no one with the clearance to ask was present at Bravo station, so the content remained hers. What those outside the room observed were the inputs and the outputs. The inputs were 3 naval officers, a sealed operational record, and the account of what had happened at November 7. The outputs were a change in the paperwork that Breton processed that afternoon, a new designation added to Voss's station record, and a formality that arrived with no ceremony but carried the weight of one. She walked out of Breton's office at 11:18. She walked to her locker. She opened it. She looked at the photograph for approximately 30 seconds. Then she closed the locker and went to check on Norris. Norris was eating breakfast, which was a good sign. Norris looked up when Voss came in and said, "You were in a meeting." Voss said, "I was." Norris said, "How did it go?" Voss said, "It went." Norris looked at her with eyes that were sharper now, the hypoxic gauze fully gone, the pilot's assessment fully restored. She said, "Your designation changed." Voss said, "How do you know that?" Norris said, "The way you're standing." A pause, and Volkov texted me. Despite herself, Voss made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was the nearest thing to one that she produced in professional settings. She said, "Of course he did." Norris said, "Is it going to change things here?" Voss looked around the room, the bed, the monitors, the particular institutional quality of the light, the small window with its view of the yard, and beyond the yard, the edge of the flight line where a helicopter was being serviced in the morning cold. She said, "Probably not, which is fine. The work doesn't change." Norris said, "But the designation?" Voss said, "The designation is paperwork. The work is this." She nodded toward the monitoring equipment, the IV stand, the cleared breakfast tray, same as it was yesterday. Norris said, "You're very hard to impress yourself." Voss said, "I've been impressed by the right things. The rest is context." She took Norris's pulse. She checked the IV line. She made a note in the chart, and Norris watched her work, and in Norris's watching there was something that was accumulating, something that happens when you observe a person doing something ordinary with extraordinary precision over time. Not admiration exactly, though admiration was part of it, more like recognition, like understanding that the thing in front of you is its own category and requires its own taxonomy. When Voss left the room, Norris leaned back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling. She thought about what it meant to be called by a name that you had earned in a language only certain people speak. She thought about what it meant to leave that language behind and then to have it find you anyway, in a different corridor, wearing different clothes, carrying a medication kit instead of a flight helmet. She thought about what it meant that the people who knew the name still trusted it, still reached for it when things went wrong at altitude and there was no margin for error and only one kind of knowing would do. She thought Ren knows what it's like. And she thought, yes, she does. Dales found the right moment 4 days later on a slow evening in the supply room where Voss was inventorying again, the same clipboard, the same methodical attention, the same locker room quality of a person doing a small task with full presence. He came in for bandage supplies and stayed when he didn't need to. He said, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "You can try." He said, "The jet in the photograph, what is it?" She looked at him, she considered, she said, "Nothing I can describe specifically." He said, "But you flew it." She said, "For 6 years." He said, "And then you came here." She said, "And then I came here." He said, "Why?" She set the clipboard down. She turned to face him fully, the way she did not often do in professional settings, a deliberate orientation that meant the answer was going to cost something and she had decided to give it anyway. She said, "I was good at the other thing, very good, good enough that the work felt clean. And clean work is seductive because it feels like integrity, but it isn't always. Sometimes it's just distance. I needed to close the distance." He was quiet. He said, "That's not a small thing to give up." She said, no, but it's not a tragedy either. People think it has to be a tragedy. It was just a choice. He said, the people in that comms room when the transmission came in, they looked at you differently after. She said, I know. He said, I looked at you differently after. She said, I know that too. He said carefully, the joke I made, it wasn't about you specifically, or I told myself it wasn't, but it was the kind of joke that only works if you're willing to assume things you don't know. She said, yes. He said, I'm a good surgeon, I try to be a good doctor, I'm not always. He stopped. He started again, I'm not always a good observer. She picked up the clipboard, she said, you're being one now. He stayed with that, he said, is that enough? She said, it's a start. She made a notation, she said, Norris asked me last night if I ever missed flying, I told her I missed the sky. He said, that's not the same thing. She said, no, but the sky is here too, that's the thing about the sky, it's always local. He didn't fully understand what she meant, but he understood that she meant it precisely and that the precision was the point. He took his bandage supplies. At the door he paused, he said, Voss. She said, no. He said, thank you for the honest answer. She said, you asked an honest question. He left, she continued the inventory. Above locker 73, somewhere down the corridor, the photograph waited in its particular quality of light, the woman, the jet, the horizon, the expression that was not performing anything, just watching, just knowing that something was coming out of it eventually. Word arrived from outside the station on a Tuesday, which was not a day that typically generated significant news. It came through official channels, which meant it came to Breton first, and Breton read it twice before he called Voss to his office. She came in and stood without sitting, which was her default posture in his office and which he had learned to read not as disrespect but as readiness. He said, you've been formally cited in the November 7 after-action report, by name, both names. She said, whose report? He said, Spear 3-1's, Volkov's unit. He passed the page across the desk. She looked at it. She did not read it with any visible emotional response. She read it the way she read monitoring equipment, absorbing data, assessing implications. She set it back on the desk. He said, that designation changed last week. What does it mean for you here? She said, officially, an addendum to my record, access to certain channels I didn't have before, nothing that affects daily function. He said, and unofficially? She said, it means that if something like November 7 happens again, they don't have to explain the request. He said, good. He leaned back. He said, I've been commanding this station for 11 months. I thought I had a complete picture of the personnel assets here. She said, nobody ever has a complete picture. He said, no, but some pictures are more incomplete than others. A pause. You could have told me. She said, I could have, but the record is what it is for reasons that aren't casual, and what I do here doesn't require you to know the rest of it. He said, no, but it would have changed things. She said, which things? He was honest enough to pause before answering. He said, the way people talk to you. She said, I know. He said, that doesn't bother you. She said, it bothers me the same way weather bothers me. It exists, it's not personal, you dress for it and you do the work. Breton looked at her for a long moment. He said, Norris is requesting a transfer back to her unit. Her medical clearance clears by the end of the week. Voss said, she's ready. The shoulder is going to be stiff for another 3 weeks, but it's functional. Her cognition is fully restored. He said, she asked if she could say goodbye before she goes. Voss said she doesn't have to ask. He said, I told her that. She said she still wanted to ask. Voss said, then tell her yes. She left the office. In the corridor, she paused for a moment, which was unusual. She stood with her hand near the wall, not touching it, just near it, in the posture of someone who has been handed a weight and is deciding how to carry it. Then she squared herself and continued walking. The citation would become part of a record that most people at Bravo Station would never read. The designation addendum would exist in a file accessible only to those who already knew what it meant. The photograph would remain above locker 73, unchanged, as it had always been, the woman, the jet, the horizon, the waiting. But something had changed in the corridor, something in the texture of how people moved through the same air as Marlowe Voss. Not deference, not exactly, something earlier than deference, the recognition that precedes it. Norris's last morning at Bravo Station had the slow quality of departure days. the packing of small items, the final institutional meals that taste specifically of finality, the looking around at a space you know you will not see again, trying to fix it in memory and finding that memory is already moving on. She was dressed in her transfer clothes, bagged by the door, sitting on the edge of the bed when Voss came in for the final check. The check was brief: shoulder range of motion, neuro baseline, vital confirmation. Norris answered every question with the crisp precision of a pilot who has been back in their own mind for long enough to trust it again. When it was done, Voss made the notation and set the chart on the bed. Norris said, "Can I tell you something before I go?" Voss said, "You've been asking that question in some form every day." Norris said, "I have things to say." Voss said, "Go ahead." Norris said, "I'm going to tell people about you, about Ren, not classified things, I know the lines, but the shape of it. That there's someone at Bravo Station who used to fly things we can't describe and who chose to come here and who was the difference in a 9-hour cold exposure survival. I'm going to tell people that." Voss said, "People at your level already know more than that." Norris said, "The pilots do, not everyone." A pause. Norris said, "You were patient with me in the helicopter and here, you let me ask questions I maybe shouldn't have asked, and you answered them honestly instead of clinically." Voss said, "Clinical honesty and personal honesty aren't always the same thing." Norris said, "No, and you knew when to use which one." She stood, she picked up her bag, she said, "I want to be that someday. I want to be the person that someone gets told to hold on until." Voss said, "You're going to be." Norris said, "How do you know?" Voss said, "Because you came out of a 9-hour cold event on the ground with a hypoxic incident in your log, and the first thing you asked me was whether the payload was secured." Norris said, "It was secured before I lost altitude." Voss said, "I know, that's the point." They looked at each other across the room with the particular quality of understanding that occasionally develops between two people who have been through a crisis together, not friendship, not exactly, but something with weight. The understanding of what each other is made of at the level that only difficulty reveals. Norris said, "When I'm a commander somewhere, I'm going to tell my people about Ren. I'm not going to say your real name, but I'm going to tell them the shape of the thing. That someone can know 2 languages, the one up there and the one down here, and that knowing both is what makes the difference." Voss said, "That's generous of you." Norris said, "It's true." Voss picked up the chart. She said, "Your vehicle is in 20 minutes. Do you have everything?" Norris said, "Yes." Voss said, "Then I'll walk you out." They went through the station together, and the corridor arranged itself around them the way corridors do when the people walking through them have a quality of intention. Other staff stepping aside not because they were asked to, but because something in the composition of the moment communicated that this was a passage worth allowing space for. At the door, Norris turned one last time. She said, "Thank you for holding what you hold." Voss said, "Safe flight." Norris nodded. She walked to the vehicle. The door closed. The engine turned. And Voss stood in the doorway of Bravo Medical Station in the specific gray light of a morning that had decided not to commit to weather, and watched the vehicle until it turned at the far end of the road and was gone. Then she went back inside. She went back to work. What happened over the following weeks at Bravo Station was not dramatic in its shape. There were no announcements. There were no formal changes to anything that was visible to someone looking from outside. The shift schedule was the same. The supply inventory happened on the same rotation. The overnight core was the same underpaid, overextended collection of people doing necessary work in insufficient light. But the texture changed, the texture of how people occupied the same space as Marlowe Voss. It began with small things. Grubb at the desk, who had previously communicated with Voss in the register of someone managing a minor logistical asset, began to precede his communications with a pause, the pause of someone checking their information before they delivered it, making sure it was worth the floor's attention. Trells, who had gone to November 7 with her and returned with more than he had taken, positioned himself differently on shared shifts, closer to her operational radius, learning the patterns of her attention the way a junior pilot learns the patterns of a lead. Driscoll in the comms room began routing certain unusual transmissions directly to Voss instead of up the standard chain, on the private calculus that Voss would know what to do with them faster. Dale's changed most visibly because he had the furthest to travel. He was a man whose confidence came from competence, and competence was genuinely what he had in abundance. He was, on any honest assessment, an extraordinary surgeon. What he had lacked was the humility that lives adjacent to competence, the understanding that the map of any room you occupy is always larger than the portion you can see. He was working on it. It showed in the particular way he asked questions now, in the slightly longer pause before he formed conclusions. Voss noticed all of this in the way she noticed everything peripherally precisely, without making it the center of her attention because that was not where her attention belonged. Her attention belonged on the patient in front of her, the IV line, the vital sign, the small crucial details of keeping people intact. That was the work, everything else was context. One evening, near the end of a shift, Breton found her in the break room, a rare event because Voss did not typically use the break room in the way that generated social interaction. She was making coffee. He poured his own and stood a respectful distance away. He said, "I received a request this week from a unit asking if you were available for a consultation." She said, "What kind of consultation?" He said, "The kind that goes through channels I didn't know I had access to." She said, "What did you tell them?" He said, "I told them you were a valuable medical asset and that any request for your time would need to account for operational continuity." She looked at him, she said, "That's surprisingly diplomatic." He said, "I've been here 11 months, I've learned things." She said, "Did you tell them anything else?" He said, "I told them you were the best nurse in my station and that I wasn't giving up a good nurse for a consultation." He paused. "I also told them that if they needed the other thing, they should go through official channels and expect to negotiate." She said, "The other thing." He said, "I don't know what to call it precisely. The November 7 thing, the Wren thing, the thing that makes Volkov's unit ask for someone by call sign instead of rank." She said, "You can call it experience." He said, "That seems insufficient." She said, "Most accurate things do." She took her coffee. She went back to the floor. Through the break room window, the flight line was visible in the evening light, the parked helicopters, the support vehicles, and above them the sky in its daily transition from the blue of operational hours to the deep violet of the space between. A sky that was always local and always the same sky and always, if you knew how to read it, slightly different from the day before. Ree came back on a Wednesday with a different envelope. This one he delivered to Breton, not to Voss, but the name on the inside documents was hers, both of them. Breton read it in his office with the door closed, and then he went to find her, and he found her in Bay 3 doing a wound assessment on a lance corporal who had managed to introduce himself to a piece of equipment at speed. He waited in the doorway until she was done. She came out, pulled off her gloves, and looked at his expression. She said, "How bad?" He said, "It's not bad, it's significant." She said, "What is it?" He said, "A formal citation for the November 7 action from 2 levels above my pay grade, and a request, not an order, a request for a consult rotation at a facility whose name I'm not going to say in the corridor." She was still, she said, "A rotation." He said, 6 weeks, your choice. They were specific about the choice part. She said, "What would it involve?" He said, "I honestly don't know. The level of specificity in the paperwork drops off sharply about 2 paragraphs in." She said, "And the station?" He said, "We'd cover it. It would be difficult," he was honest, "but we'd cover it." She said, "I need to think about it." He said, "Of course." She said, 24 hours. He said, "They gave me a week." She said, "I need 24 hours. She went back into Bay 3. The lance corporal was looking at the ceiling. She washed her hands. She resumed the assessment, and the 24 hours began, and she used them the way she used time, economically, purposefully, without performance. At the end of the 24 hours, she went to Breton's office. She said, "I'll do the rotation." He said, "Any conditions?" She said, 1, Trells comes with me if the facility can support 2. He said, "He's your pick." She said, "He's steady and he learns from watching instead of asking. That's the right kind of learner for whatever this is going to be." Breton said, "I'll make the request." She nodded. She turned to go. At the door she stopped. She said, "Whatever this is, the citations, the requests, the designation, it doesn't change the work here." He said, "I know." She said, "I want to make sure you know." He said, "Voss, I know, you've made it clear in every shift for 2 years that the work here is the point." She said, "Good." She left. He sat in his office with the citation and the request in front of him on the desk, and he thought about what it meant to have someone like Marlowe Voss at a forward medical station, what it meant for the station to have been, without knowing it, more than it appeared. He thought about the photograph above locker 73, which he had seen and not thought about until now, and he thought that it was the best possible kind of object in the world, a true thing in plain sight that became visible only when you were ready to see it. The morning before the rotation departure had the particular crispness of an early transitional day, still cold, but with a quality of light that was pointing forward rather than inward. Voss was at her locker before 600, which was earlier than anyone else on her shift. She removed what she needed for the rotation deployment and did it with the systematic efficiency of someone who has packed things into bags in many different contexts and has refined the process to its essential motion. The photograph stayed. She did not take it down. She did not move it. It remained above locker 73 in its slightly crooked angle. She had never straightened it, which was the one small asymmetry in an otherwise orderly space, and it watched the locker room in the gray morning light with its own particular quality of patience. Trells arrived at 6:30. He looked at the locker, looked at the photograph, looked at Voss. He said, "I've been thinking about the photograph." She said, "What about it?" He said, "I used to think it was a personal thing, like a memento." She said, "It is a memento." He said, "But not the way I thought. I thought it was like a reminder of something you missed, but I think it's actually the opposite." She said, "Say it." He said, "I think it's a reminder that you did it, that you were there, that the thing happened, so that when you're here doing this work, you know it's not an absence of the other thing, it's a choice." She put the last item in the bag, she zipped it. She said, "You learned from watching." He said, "I told you I would." She picked up the bag, she looked at the photograph one more time, the woman, the jet, the horizon, the squint against the light, the hands in the pockets. She said, "The crosswind was late." He said, "What?" She said, "Nothing, let's go." They walked out into the corridor and the station moved around them in its morning patterns. The shift change, the early meal, the particular ambient noise of a place that never fully stops. People moved aside in the corridor, not entirely consciously. There was the quality of recognition now, not celebrity, nothing like that, but the simpler and more durable thing, the knowledge of what someone is. Dales was at the desk near the entrance. He saw them coming and he straightened, not quite to attention but close, in the instinctive way of a man who has revised his understanding of a situation and whose body is still catching up to his mind. He said, "Safe travels." Voss said, "Hold the station together." He said, "That's your job." She said, "Today it's yours." She pushed through the door into the morning light and Trells followed and the door swung closed behind them. The station continued. The shifts turned. The work went on, the dressings and the IV lines and the monitoring and the hard, careful keeping alive of people in difficult places, the work that was always the point. Above locker 73, the photograph held its position. The woman with the squint, the jet that consumed light, the horizon that held its secret. Outside, the sky opened the way it always does in the morning, indifferent and complete and available to anyone who thought to look up. The facility where the rotation took place was designated, in the paperwork that Breton received, only by a grid coordinate and a unit code. What it actually was, Voss had a more specific understanding of a training and integration center for personnel who moved between operational domains, who needed to speak both the language of the field and the language of the specialist, who had to be current in 2 different registers simultaneously. She was there not to fly, she was there to teach. This became clear on the first morning, when she was introduced to a group of 12 people in a briefing room whose average age was approximately 26, and whose collective intensity was the particular kind generated by people who have been selected for things. They sat in a loose horseshoe arrangement with tablets and notebooks, and the contained alertness of people who have been told that the next 6 weeks are going to reorder something. The officer who introduced her said her name and her rank and her current assignment, and then he said, simply, "Petty Officer Voss brings a combination of operational flight experience and forward medical practice that is, within this command, unique. She's going to spend the next 6 weeks helping you understand the interface between those 2 domains. You will pay attention." He left. Voss stood at the front of the room. The 12 faces looked at her with the calibrated attention of people who had been trained to read other people quickly and had just received new input that required processing. They had expected someone who looked more like what they had been told she was. They were recalibrating in real time. She let the silence do its work for exactly long enough. Then she said, "The aircraft in the photograph above my locker at Bravo Station is a real aircraft that I flew for 6 years. Some of you may have a clearance level sufficient to look it up. Some of you don't yet. What I will tell you about it without specifics is this. It requires a pilot to maintain full situational awareness at altitudes and airspeeds where hypoxia is not a theoretical risk but a managed reality. It requires precise manual inputs under conditions of significant physiological stress. And it requires, when things go wrong, the ability to make triage decisions in the cockpit the same way a trauma nurse makes triage decisions in a bay, fast, sequential, committed." She paused, she let them sit with it. She said, 3 weeks ago, a pilot from a unit adjacent to this command went down at November 7 in a hypoxic event. She was on the ground for 9 hours. I was requested by call sign to go to the site. I am a nurse. I went because I know from the inside what a hypoxic event feels like and how to communicate with someone who is experiencing one. That is the interface I am going to teach you about, not the theory of it. The actual texture of what it means to carry two kinds of knowledge and know when to use each one. In the third row, a young aviator named Petty Officer Sable, who was 24 years old and had the kind of coiled certainty of someone who had never yet been surprised by their own limits, wrote something in her notebook. Later, someone who sat next to her would say they couldn't read it at the time. Later still, Sable herself would say she wrote, "She's the real thing." 6 weeks compressed the way time always does when the content is sufficient, not fast, not slow, but filled, in the way a good container is filled. Voss taught. She had not formally taught before, but she approached it with the same quality of attention she applied to everything, which meant she observed what was working and adjusted what wasn't without announcement in real time, the way good pilots adjust trim. She taught the physical realities of hypoxia, not from a textbook but from recall, from the specific phenomenology of the gray gauze, the narrowing peripheral vision, the particular way decision-making degrades before the person experiencing the degradation is aware it is degrading. She taught the decision tree of in-flight medical emergencies with the grounded specificity of someone who has lived inside one. She taught the intersection of tactical communication and medical assessment, how to read a voice on a channel for physiological state the way you read a monitor for vital signs. Trells, who had come with her as requested, ran the practical components. He was good in front of the group in a way that surprised even him, calm, specific, capable of translating the clinical into the operational without losing precision in either direction. At the end of the 4th week, Sable stayed after a session. She waited until the room had emptied. She said, "I want to ask you something personal." Voss said, "Ask." Sable said, "Why did you stop flying?" Not the official answer, the real one. Voss said, "I gave the real answer to someone else once. It didn't get shorter with repetition." Sable said, "I'll take the long version." Voss looked at her. She said, "In the aircraft I was very good and very alone with my very goodness. I made decisions that had consequences I could calculate but couldn't witness. Over time, I began to feel the gap between the calculation and the witness. The gap was eating something I couldn't afford to lose." Sable said, "What was it eating?" Voss said, "The belief that the work connects to something human." Sable was quiet for a moment. She said, "And nursing closes the gap." Voss said, "Nursing is the gap. You're standing in it all the time. The distance between what is wrong and what you can do about it is exactly the length of your hands." Sable said, "That sounds like it would be harder." Voss said, "It is harder, but it's harder in a way that makes things real. The other kind of hard is—" She stopped. She looked for the word. She said, "Isolated, technically pure and humanly isolated. Not everyone finds that insufficient. For me, it became insufficient." Sable wrote something. She looked up. She said, "I think I'm the kind of person who might find it sufficient, at least for now." Voss said, "Then fly, be very good at it, and leave room to be wrong about whether it's sufficient. That's the thing I didn't leave enough room for." Sable nodded. She left. Voss stayed in the empty briefing room for a few minutes, standing at the front looking at the horseshoe of chairs. She thought, this is also a form of the work. This is also the room where the outcome happens. She turned off the light. She went to prepare the next day's session. The last day of the rotation ended not with ceremony but with the quiet of concluded work. The 12 people who had spent 6 weeks in the briefing room on the practical courses in the simulation bays had the look of people who had been significantly reorganized, not transformed, not replaced, but added to in a way that would become apparent over time and in context rather than immediately. This was the nature of real teaching, which does not produce visible results in the short run and is therefore often undervalued by those who measure in the short run. Voss and Trells were processed out of the facility with the standard departure procedures. Paperwork, equipment return, the particular administrative choreography of institutional exit. At the gate, the officer who had introduced Voss on the first morning was waiting. He said nothing significant. He shook her hand. He looked at her for a moment in the way of someone confirming an assessment, finding it correct and being satisfied. Then he nodded and returned inside. On the transport back to Bravo Station, Trells said, "I've been thinking about what comes next." She said, "What conclusions have you reached?" He said, "That I want to be better at more things." She said, "That's a good conclusion." He said, "I've been putting in for advanced trauma certification. It's been on my list for 2 years and I've kept deprioritizing it." She said, "What changed?" He said, "Watching you, the way you hold 2 things at once and use both of them." She said, "You already do that." He said, not as well. She said, that's why they invented certification. He said, you're not going to give me the speech about how I'm already good. She said, you don't need that speech, you need the certification. He laughed a real laugh, the kind that means something landed true. He said, yeah, okay. The transport moved through late afternoon light, the particular amber of a day that has done its work and is preparing to hand off to the evening. The sky through the window was clear, with a long horizontal streak of cloud near the horizon that caught the light in an orange that edged toward red. Voss watched it. She thought about 6 weeks of mornings in a briefing room. She thought about Sable's notebook. She thought about Norris on the stretcher in the hello, the effort in her eyes, the decision to give that effort permission to rest. She thought about the Lance Corporal with the equipment injury in the break room at 200 and the joke that wasn't about her specifically, and about Dales at the station saying safe travels with his body, a fraction straighter than it used to be. She thought about the photograph. She thought about the morning after the landing, the person with the camera, the image developing somewhere in a darkroom she had never seen, the envelope arriving 6 months later with no note. Someone had wanted her to have it. Someone had known somehow that she would need to be reminded of the things she had done, in the place that wasn't in the record, on the strip that was too short, with the crosswind that arrived late. The sky through the window deepened. The streak of cloud caught more red. And Voss held the image of it the way she held most things, with precision, with patience, with the full understanding that everything in her field of vision was temporary and everything she had done with her hands would outlast the moment of doing it. This was the truth about certain kinds of people. The record of what they carry does not fit on a form. The range of what they can do is larger than what they have been asked to demonstrate. They live in the gap between what is visible and what is real, and they do not ask for the gap to be closed. They simply continue in it methodically, with their hands and their training and their knowledge of what the crosswind feels like when it's late. The transport landed. They collected their gear. Bravo Station came into view in the dusk, the yard, the flight line, the particular institutional quality of a place that does necessary work in the dark. She was home, which was a word she used carefully and meant precisely. Bravo Station had continued, as stations do, without her. The shifts turning, the supply inventories cycling, the small daily urgencies of keeping people alive in difficult places. It had not gone unmissed, what she had taken with her for 6 weeks. This was something nobody said aloud, but that was present in the particular quality of relief that moved through the overnight shift when they saw her walk in on the first morning back. She noticed, she did not acknowledge it. She went to her locker, spun the combination, opened the door. The photograph was exactly as she'd left it, the crooked angle unchanged, the light on the paper unchanged, the woman and the jet and the horizon unchanged. She changed into her scrubs, she pulled her hair back. She picked up the shift report from the handover board and read it with the concentrated attention of someone for whom there is no such thing as a routine task, only tasks performed with variable levels of care. Grubb said, good to have you back, petty officer. She said, what's the status on Bay 2? He told her. She went to Bay 2. The work began again, continuous and specific and necessary, and it felt, as it always did, in the way that things you have chosen feel when you return to them, exactly right. Dales found her later that morning between rounds. He said, how was it? She said, useful. He said, for them or for you? She said, both. That's how teaching works when it's working. He said, I've been thinking about what you told me, about why you left the program. She said, the part about distance. He said, yeah. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I think I've been managing distance in surgery too, professional distance. The kind that's supposed to be healthy, but I'm not sure it always is. She said, distance is a tool like anything. It becomes a problem when it's not a choice anymore. He said, how do you know when it's no longer a choice? She said, when you can't close it even when you need to. He absorbed this. He said, I'm going to be thinking about that for a while. She said, good. She moved to the next room. He watched her go. He had, over the past weeks in her absence, been doing the kind of thinking that happens when someone who has reorganized your understanding of a situation is no longer present to observe. You sit with the new version of things without the distraction of confirming it in real time, and it either holds or it doesn't. His version had held. More than held, it had extended. He had found himself applying the recalibration to other things. To the way he read patients, to the way he talked to juniors, to the space he left in his conclusions for what he didn't know yet. This was the specific way that Marlowe Voss changed people, not by announcement, not by instruction, but by demonstrating a quality of presence that, once seen clearly, made the absence of it visible everywhere else. It was the kind of influence that didn't expire because it had reorganized something structural rather than just behavioral. He went back to his own work. The station continued. The sky outside moved through its daily arc from iron to pewter to clear to darkening blue. The photograph waited above locker 73 in its permanent quiet. The acknowledgement came 6 weeks after the rotation ended, in the form most appropriate to the culture, not a ceremony but a record change. The kind that arrives in an official envelope and is processed through Breton's office and delivered to the relevant person with the minimum viable transaction of institutional recognition. A document, a handshake, a notation. But something about this one was different. The envelope that arrived for Marlowe Voss contained, in addition to the record amendment and the formal citation language, a handwritten note. The note was from Norris, written on paper that had the look of something torn from a private journal and then reconsidered and sent anyway. Norris wrote, "I am in a new assignment with a new unit. On the first day, someone asked me who had made the biggest impression on my career. I told them about the 12-word transmission that saved my life. Bravo Medical, this is Spear 3-1. And then Ren, that you, and I told them what happened next. I told them about the woman who knew 2 languages and chose to live in the one that kept people closer to what they were protecting. I told them I wanted to be half that. I told them I was working on it." The unit commander, who has 30 years and 3 combat deployments and whose opinion I have come to value more than almost anything, said, "That's the right thing to want to be. You should know that. You should know your shape is visible even at distance." Voss read it twice. She folded it. She put it in the locker, not with the photograph, but in the inside pocket of her jacket, which was where she kept things that needed to be close rather than visible. She closed the locker. She went back to work. What the note said and what she kept returning to in the intervals between rounds, the quiet 10 seconds between one bay and the next, the still moment while the IV bag was hanging and the patient's breathing was regular and there was nothing to do yet but be present, was that her shape was visible even at distance. That the choice she had made to close the gap, to come out of the clean isolation and into the corridor where the outcomes were visible, had not diminished the thing she had been before but had added something to it that made it visible from farther away. She had not thought about it in those terms. She had thought about it as a choice between 2 kinds of knowledge and a judgment about which kind she needed to live inside. She had not thought about how a person looks from the outside when they make that kind of choice and commit to it with total consistency for years. She thought, this is what Trells saw in the helicopter. This is what Sable wrote in her notebook. This is what made Breton step aside in the comms room without being asked, not the classified record, not the call sign, the consistency, the particular quality of someone who has decided what they're for and is doing it completely. And the thing that made it land, the specific weight of Norris's note, was the word shape, not achievement, not record, shape, the thing that persists across contexts, the thing that is visible even when the details are classified and the record is incomplete and the photograph is just a photograph above a locker that no one thought to ask about. The sky outside the station window was high and clear and cold, the kind that has no apology in it, the kind that has always been there, waiting. The last ordinary day is never marked. It doesn't announce itself. It presents in the same configuration as every day before it, the supply cart, the shift report, the corridor in the particular light of morning, and only becomes identifiable as the last ordinary day in retrospect, from the vantage point of whatever follows it. For Bravo Station, what followed was a transfer of command. Breton's 11 months became 12, became the completion of his deployment, and the orders that had always been coming finally arrived on a Thursday morning with the clean finality of the institutional. He would be replaced by a lieutenant commander whose name appeared in the orders, but who was not yet a person to anyone at the station, still just a name. On his last evening, Breton found Voss in the break room, the same bad coffee, the same 200 quality of light, though it was not 200 and the light was the evening variety. She had a mug. She was standing at the window looking at the flight line. He said, "I'm leaving Friday." She said, "I know." He said, "The incoming commander is good. I've worked with her before." She said, "Her." He said, "Ree spoke well of her, specifically in the context of November 7 and its follow-on." This was information that had additional texture, and Voss received it with the slight adjustment of someone for whom additional texture matters. She said, "Good." He said, "I want to tell you something before I go." She waited. He said, "When I first arrived here, I thought I understood what kind of station this was. Forward medical support, good personnel, reasonable capability, standard parameters. I thought I had the complete picture." She said, "You didn't." He said, "No, because of you." She said, "The picture was always the same, you just didn't have all the information." He said, "That's true, but here's what I've been sitting with. Most stations don't have a Marlowe Voss. Most stations have exactly what they appear to have. This station has been, for 2 years, something more than it knew, because of what you carry and what you've decided to do with it here." She said, "The work." He said, "I know, the work is the point, you don't need to say it." He paused. He said, "I'm saying it the other way. The work is the point, and you are the reason the work here has been done at a level that exceeds what the station's profile would suggest. That is a fact. I want to say it plainly before I leave." The break room held the silence of a space where something true has just been said. Voss looked at the flight line through the window. She said, "I appreciate that." He said, "I know you do, you just don't require it." She said, "Correct." He said, "That's also a skill." He picked up his coffee. "The incoming commander is going to want to meet you early. I told her to wait until you've had a chance to form your own opinion of her." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because the opinion I've formed of you is that your first opinions are reliable, and I don't want the setup to get in the way of the reading." She looked at him. Something in her expression acknowledged the particular quality of that, the thoughtfulness of it. She said, "That's a good instinct." He said, "I've been learning to have them." He finished his coffee. He set the mug down. At the door he said, "Safe watch, Voss." She said, "Safe travels, sir." He left. She stood at the window a while longer, looking at the flight line and the dark sky above it, which was clear and populated by the specific stars that appear when there is no moon and the air is cold and the horizon is wide. She looked at them the way she looked at everything, with flat, cataloging, deeply attentive eyes that were, if you knew where to look, doing something more than cataloging. She was locating herself, the way all pilots do on some level even when they are not flying, placing themselves in relation to the sky. Not to navigate, there was nowhere to go tonight, but to confirm the relationship, that the sky was still there, that it knew her, that the long reciprocity between a person and the air above them, once established, does not expire. She finished her coffee. She went back to work. The incoming station commander arrived on a Monday with the specific efficiency of someone who has moved between assignments many times and has developed the practice of making sense of a new environment quickly without imposing premature conclusions on it. Her name was Commander Priya Vasudevan. She was 41, with deployment history across 3 theaters and a quality of settled competence that manifested not as confidence in the conventional sense, but as the absence of wasted motion. She knew what she was about. On her first day, she did not call a full station meeting. She took the briefing from the outgoing staff, walked the facility, reviewed the operational record. She spoke to each department head. In the afternoon, she came to the medical floor. Voss was with a patient. Vasudevan waited in the corridor without announcing herself and observed for approximately 4 minutes before Voss turned and saw her. They looked at each other. Vasudevan said, "Don't stop for me." Voss returned to the patient. She completed the procedure. She came out and pulled off her gloves. She said, "Commander." Vasudevan said, "Petty Officer Voss." A pause. "I'm told I was supposed to form my own opinion of you." Voss said, "Breton told me the same thing in reverse." Vasudevan said, "Good, then we're both going in clean." She looked at the corridor, at the bay, at the supply cart, at the quality of the floor. She said, "This station has a reputation within certain channels for outperforming its profile." Voss said, "The staff is good." Vasudevan said, "The staff is what I'd expect for a forward medical station of this size. The outperformance is something else." She said it without accusation, without inflation, as a factual observation. Then she said, "I read the November 7 report." Voss said, Vasudevan said, "I've seen citation language like that before, not often." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I want you to know that I'm not going to change what you're doing here. I'm going to watch it for a while and understand it, then I'm going to get out of its way." Voss said, "That's a good approach for most things." Vasudevan said, "Breton told me that too, in different words." She looked at Voss with the particular quality of one experienced professional assessing another, not hierarchically, but laterally, mapping the parameters. She said, "He also told me you were the most honest person in his station." Voss said, "He said that about me to you." Vasudevan said, "He said it about you to me and then said it was the most important thing on his handover list." She paused. "He didn't explain it. I think he thought it would explain itself." Voss said, "It usually does." Vasudevan said, "Give it time." Voss said, "Yes." Vasudevan nodded. She turned to go. She said, without turning back, "One more thing. I know what the photograph above locker 73 is." Voss said, "A lot of people know now." Vasudevan said, "I mean, I know specifically. I had clearance at a previous posting to the relevant program documentation." A pause. "That was a very difficult aircraft to fly." Voss said, "Yes." Vasudevan said, "And you flew it for 6 years?" Voss said, "Yes." Vasudevan said, "And then you came here?" Voss said, "Yes." Vasudevan turned then briefly. Her expression had in it something that was not quite admiration and not quite recognition, something between them or containing both or preceding both. She said, "I'm glad you did." She walked back down the corridor toward the administrative wing. Voss watched her go. She thought, this is going to be a good working arrangement. She was almost never wrong about things she assessed directly. She returned to the floor. The photograph above Locker 73 remained. Through commander changes and deployment cycles, through supply chain disruptions and equipment upgrades, through the rotating cast of personnel who came through Bravo Station and added their own particular human texture to its ongoing story, the photograph remained. It became, over time, a kind of station landmark, the thing new arrivals noticed and sometimes asked about, and the thing experienced personnel either deflected or answered depending on their read of who was asking. The full story of it did not circulate widely because full stories never do. What circulated was the outline, a nurse with a classified flying background, a call that came in on an unfamiliar channel, a name used in the kind of context where names carry weight. The joke that Dales had made in the break room became, over months, the kind of story told in the opposite spirit of its original telling, not as evidence of what the speaker had gotten right, but as evidence of how completely you can misread a room. Dales told the story himself, eventually. He told it to a new surgical resident who had made a glib dismissal of a nursing assessment during a complicated procedure, and he told it with the particular bluntness of someone who has earned the right to the lesson by having failed it personally. The resident listened. Dales said, "The most dangerous assumption in a medical setting is that the person who's been here longer than you is only what their title describes." He said, "I made that assumption about the best clinical operator I have ever worked beside, and I was comprehensively wrong, and the wrongness cost me several weeks of not understanding the room I was in." The resident said, "What changed?" Dales said, "She didn't, I did." The story carried from that resident to others, and from others to the unit that Norris was part of, and from there to a training environment where Sable was, by then teaching her own section, and Sable, when she heard the version that had traveled to her, recognized it from the inside and added a detail that hadn't made it. That Voss, on the first day of the rotation, had said the actual texture of what it means to carry 2 kinds of knowledge and know when to use each one. That line had gone into Sable's notebook, it had not left. Volkov, who operated in channels where stories moved differently, said nothing to anyone about Ren. He did not need to. The people who needed to know what Ren was in the places where that knowledge mattered already knew. And the people who didn't have clearance for the specifics had over time accumulated something sufficient from the outline. A woman who knew the sky and chose the corridor, who could be reached by call sign in an emergency, who answered when the channel opened. The sky above Bravo Station was always local. It was always the same sky. It was on the mornings Voss walked to her shift in the particular light of the transition between night and not night, a continuous reminder that the things you have done with your body and your hands and your attention, the landings and the dressings and the IV lines and the 6 years of altitude and the 2 years of corridor, are not separate chapters. They are the same story told in different registers, accumulating into the shape of a person who is visible even at distance. She was 40 years old on the morning she walked in to find a small group of personnel standing near the administrative board where shift assignments were posted. There was something in their configuration that was slightly off from routine, the quality of an audience rather than a passing cluster. She approached. She saw that someone had taped a printed note beside the shift board. The note said, "Happy birthday, Commander." Not commander in the formal sense. In the sense that some words accrete meaning through use rather than through institution, through the particular quality of enough occasions where a person has been, simply and consistently, the most reliable presence in the room. She stood in front of the note for a moment. She read it. She said nothing. She turned and went to her locker, spun the combination, changed into her scrubs. She looked at the photograph. She looked at it the way she looked at the sky, with recognition, without ceremony, a true thing in plain sight, requiring no explanation. She pulled her hair back. She picked up the shift report. She went to work. The sky outside held its light. The corridor held its sound. And somewhere in the flat distance between what is classified and what is known, between the aircraft that cannot be named and the work that happens in the room where outcomes are visible, The shape of Marlowe Voss continued, patient, precise in the gap, exactly where she had chosen to be.